Hello, this is Pastor Rick, and I want to welcome you to the Sunday Forum for this Sunday, February the 23rd. We have a fascinating topic, maybe, just maybe a topic you've never thought about before. Or maybe you have as you've read these two sermons in the Bible, the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew and the Sermon on the Plain in Luke. Maybe you've asked yourself the question, is this one sermon or two? And so that's our topic. Two sermons or one, the Sermon on the Mount and or on the Plain. Now I have to say this is an age-old debate among scholars of are they one or two sermons? And I'm going to give you my opinion right off the bat. I think it's one sermon that was edited by Matthew and Luke for different audiences. Matthew, his focus there is on disciples in a larger Jewish community, and so the commandments are seen as part of the larger covenant with God, between the Jewish people and God, where in Luke it's more for a Gentile audience, and there, even though the cloud is there, the larger crowd, he focuses in just on the disciples who have been persecuted and beaten and who are struggling. So, one sermon edited differently by Matthew and Luke. So why the argument? Well, if you read both of these sermons, and I encourage you to do it, Sermon on the Mount, 3 chapters in Matthew, 5, 6, and 7, a Sermon on the Plain, Luke, just part of Luke's chapter 6. You'll see there are many similarities and there are many differences. And so then that's the question, what has happened there? But more important than the academic question is you need to know that when people have read the sermon, and I'm encouraging you to read both sermons as sermons in their entirety, people's lives have been changed. Let me just mention 3 that have impressed me this week. First was Leo Tolstoy. Here he was, an aristocrat in Russia, of course, wrote War and Peace. He went through the Crimean War. All he knew was that type of struggle in society. And even though he came from a pretty well-off family and had seen all these struggles that we see in a lot of his novels, he converts to Christ when he reads the Sermon on the Mount and writes a book called My Religion to talk about his conversion to Christ through one sermon. Or Dietrich Bonhoeffer, as you know, he fought the Nazis in World War II, and part of his defense against Nazi ideology was the Sermon on the Mount. He felt it was so important in training disciples to follow Jesus, who could then oppose an evil regime, that he made it a part of his curriculum to all the students at Finkenwalde. Discipleship, or Cost of Discipleship, is the book that he wrote to marry the 2 ideas of the Sermon on the Mount, what Jesus taught, and Luther's justification by faith. Now, the third person was Kurt Vonnegut. You're going, wait a minute, Kurt Vonnegut, he was a humanist. He wasn't a Christian. That is true. He's known for his books. And believe me, Slaughterhouse-Five, Cat's Cradle, or Breakfast of Champions do not reflect the Sermon on the Mount or the Sermon on the Plain. And yet, even though he's a humanist, he loved the teachings of Jesus in both of these sermons. In fact, he's often called a Christ-loving atheist or a Christ-worshiping agnostic. He didn't like the church. He didn't like Christian doctrine. But he loved Jesus, the Jesus he discovered in these 2 sermons. Okay, so what are the differences? First of all, the setting. As you notice, Matthew, it's Sermon on the Mount, and Luke, it's on the plain. The length is also quite different. Matthew has got 3 chapters of the Sermon on the Mount and a partial chapter in Luke chapter 6. Matthew includes the 10 Commandments, where Luke, it's more about love your enemies. They both start with blessings, but Luke continues with woes. And so there are these important differences, but I think the most important one that you'll pick up is that Matthew talks spiritually. He says, blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness. That's a kind of a spiritual message where Luke, he's kind of earthy, down to earth, talking about real problems. So he says, blessed are the poor, not the poor in spirit, the poor, the hungry, and those who have been persecuted. The similarities, though, we have the blessings, the love your enemies, turn your cheek, give to those who ask, act like you want people to treat you, judge not, forgive, be generous. I mean, all these pieces are contained in both sermons. But now here's the thing. They both end the same way. The Lord says, build your life on a solid foundation. Matthew talks about don't build it on the sand. And Luke says don't build it on a bad foundation. But these are not just good suggestions from Jesus. It's how we're to build our life. In fact, in Luke, he says this is how you build your heart. Build your heart like you build your life, with building as a metaphor. So here's what I'm encouraging. I'm giving homework here. Read both sermons. Because in the end, it's an academic debate whether there's one sermon or two. We need both sermons. We need both sermons. And if you read them, you will be, I just promise you, you'll be like Tolstoy or Bonhoeffer, or maybe even like Kurt Vonnegut. If you read the sermons this week, you'll enter the service on Sunday blessed. Thanks for joining us on the Sunday Forum. Bye-bye now.